It's been 2 years since I fled my farm, yet the memory of that cursed scarecrow still haunts my every waking moment. Before those terrifying events, I was just another struggling farmer, trying to make ends meet in an increasingly difficult agricultural market. I never believed in the supernatural or rural superstitions. How naive I was, how unprepared for the horror that would consume my life and chase me far from the land I once called home. The summer heat beat down mercilessly as I surveyed my struggling cornfield. Crows had been decimating my crops, and with finances already tight, I couldn't afford another bad harvest. That's when I decided to put up a scarecrow. I found an old set of my work clothes and stuffed them with straw from the barn. For the head, I used a burlap sack, painting a simple face with black paint. 2 large buttons served as eyes, their dark surfaces gleaming in the sunlight. As I hoisted the scarecrow onto its pole in the middle of the field, a chill ran down my spine despite the heat. Something about its posture, the way its head lolled to one side, felt oddly alive. "Don't be ridiculous," I muttered to myself, shaking off the feeling. "It's just a bunch of old clothes and straw." That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I glanced out my bedroom window towards the field. In the pale moonlight, I could just make out the silhouette of the scarecrow. For a moment, I could have sworn its head had turned, facing directly towards my window. I blinked, and it was back in its original position. Exhaustion, I told myself. Nothing more than tricks of light and an overactive imagination. If only I had trusted that first instinct of unease. If only I had taken it down right then and there. But I didn't, and that decision would change my life forever. The next morning, I headed out to check on the crops, feeling optimistic about my new scarecrow's efficacy. As I approached the field, however, that optimism quickly turned to confusion, then to a creeping sense of dread. The scarecrow had moved. Not just a slight shift that could be explained by wind, but a complete change in position. It was now facing the opposite direction. Its button eyes seemed to follow me as I walked around it. "This isn't possible," I whispered, circling the pole. The ground around it was undisturbed. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. Over the next few days, I found myself constantly checking on the scarecrow. Each morning, it would be in a different position. Sometimes facing the house, sometimes the barn, always with those unblinking button eyes that seemed far too aware. Then the animals started disappearing. First, it was a couple of chickens. Then one of my cats failed to come home. I tried to convince myself it was just coyotes or foxes, but deep down, a terrifying suspicion was beginning to form. One evening, as dusk fell, I watched from my porch as a murder of crows descended on the cornfield. They circled the scarecrow, cawing furiously. Suddenly, as if struck by an invisible hand, several birds dropped from the sky. The rest scattered in panic. When I went to investigate, I found the fallen crows arranged in a perfect circle around the scarecrow's base. Their necks were broken, eyes pecked out. And the scarecrow, was it my imagination, or did I see the faintest trace of a smile on its painted burlap face? That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the old farmhouse, every rustle of wind through the corn, set my nerves on edge. And always, I felt those button eyes watching, waiting. As the days wore on, my sense of unease grew into full-blown paranoia. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that burlap face peering at me from around corners or through windows. One afternoon, while working in the barn, I felt an overwhelming sensation of being watched. I turned to find the scarecrow visible through the open door, its head turned at an impossible angle to face me directly. I blinked, and it was back in its normal position, but the feeling of its gaze lingered. The nights became a torment. Strange sounds echoed from the fields, rustling that was too deliberate to be wind, and sometimes what sounded like footsteps through the corn. I'd wake in cold sweats, certain I'd seen a silhouette outside my window, only for it to vanish when I looked again. I began to notice other changes too. The crops near the scarecrow grew at an unnatural rate, but they had a sickly, almost flesh-like quality to them. The air around the field became thick with the smell of decay, despite the flourishing plants. Desperate for some rational explanation, I confided in my neighbor, old Tom. He listened to my story with growing concern, then said something that chilled me to my core. "You didn't use any of your own blood when you made it, did you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I started to shake my head, then froze. I had pricked my finger on a nail while building the scarecrow. A few drops of blood had soaked into the burlap face. Tom's face went pale. "You've given it life," he said, "and now it hungers for more." Tom's words haunted me, but I still clung to the hope that there must be some logical explanation. That hope was shattered the very next morning. As I approached the field, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A set of footprints led from the scarecrow's post, meandering through the corn before returning. They were no animal tracks. The shape was clearly that of a human foot, but the stride was impossibly long. Panic rising, I ran to the scarecrow. It stood innocently in its place, but now I noticed dark stains on its clothes that hadn't been there before. And its feet. They were caked with the same rich, dark soil as the footprints. I stumbled back to the house and called the sheriff. When he arrived, I babbled my story, pointing frantically at the footprints. But as we walked to the field, my words died in my throat. The prints were gone, the ground unmarked. The sheriff gave me a look of mingled pity and suspicion. "Maybe you should take a break, son," he said. "Working alone out here, it's easy for the mind to play tricks." But I knew what I had seen. As the sheriff drove away, I caught sight of the scarecrow. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw it turn its head to watch the car leave. That night, I barricaded myself in the house, every light blazing. I sat by the window, a loaded shotgun across my lap, watching the scarecrow. 4 hours. Nothing happened. Then, as the moon reached its zenith, I saw it move. It was no trick of the light this time. The scarecrow lifted its arm, straw-stuffed fingers flexing. Then, with jerky, unnatural movements, it began to climb down from its post. Terror paralyzed me as I watched it take its first steps across the field. Its button eyes gleamed in the moonlight, fixed directly on my window. And on its burlap face was a grin that no human hand had painted. My paralysis broke as the scarecrow took its first lurching step towards the house. I scrambled away from the window, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The shotgun shook in my hands as I backed into a corner, eyes fixed on the door. The sounds that followed will haunt me forever. Slow, dragging footsteps on the porch. The creak of floorboards. And then, a scratching at the door. Not the scrabbling of an animal, but the deliberate, almost thoughtful movement of something that knew it had all the time in the world. I don't know how long I sat there, gun trained on the door, listening to that awful scratching. But suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Then I heard it, a soft thud from upstairs. My blood turned to ice as I realized I'd left the upstairs window open. The floorboards above me groaned under an unnatural weight. Straw rustled with each heavy step. It was inside. Survival instinct took over. I bolted for the back door, fumbling with the lock. As I finally wrenched it open, I heard a sound behind me, a dry, whispering laugh that no human throat could produce. I ran. Through the moonlit yard, past the barn, into the cornfield. The plants seemed to reach for me, their leaves slicing at my skin. Behind me, I heard the steady, relentless pace of the scarecrow. I burst into the clearing where it had stood guard for so many nights. What I saw there stopped me in my tracks. The ground was littered with bones, small animals, mostly, but some disturbingly larger. And in the center, freshly dug, was a hole just big enough for a man. A twig snapped behind me. I whirled around to find myself face to face with the scarecrow. Up close, I could see the burlap of its face writhing, as if alive. Its button eyes gleamed with an intelligence that was anything but human. It reached for me with straw-stuffed hands, its stitched mouth opening to reveal rows of impossibly sharp teeth. In that moment, I understood with horrifying clarity. I wasn't meant to be its master. I was meant to be its food. I don't remember much of what happened next. Somehow, I managed to dodge its grasp and run. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, not daring to look back. When I finally stopped, I found myself on the outskirts of town. Gasping for breath, I pounded on the first door I saw. The elderly couple who answered took one look at my wild eyes and torn clothes and called the police. I babbled my story to the sheriff, pleading with him to go to the farm to see for himself. But when we arrived the next morning, the scarecrow was back on its post, looking as innocent as the day I made it. The bones, the freshly dug grave, all gone. The sheriff suggested I take some time off, maybe see a therapist. But I knew the truth. As we drove away, I caught a glimpse of the scarecrow in the rearview mirror. It had turned to watch us leave. I left town that day, driving until I ran out of gas. I've been moving ever since, never staying in one place too long. Because sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I'll see a familiar straw-stuffed figure. In crowds, I'll catch a glimpse of button eyes watching me. I know the truth now. The scarecrow is still out there. And it's still hungry. It's been 2 years since I fled my farm, but the nightmare is far from over. I've traversed the country, taken odd jobs, and slept in countless motels, always looking over my shoulder. At first, I thought I was safe. Months passed without incident. But then, on a rainy night in a small Oregon town, I saw it. The scarecrow, standing motionless across the street, water streaming down its burlap face. By the time I blinked, it was gone. Since then, the sightings have become more frequent. A glimpse in a crowded subway station. A shadow in the corner of a diner. Once, I woke to find straw on my pillow. I know now that there's no escaping it. The scarecrow is patient, relentless. It will follow me to the ends of the earth if it has to. And one day, when I least expect it, those button eyes will be the last thing I see. I was just another struggling farmer, trying to make ends meet in an increasingly difficult agricultural market. I had inherited the farm from my uncle, a man I barely knew, and saw it as a fresh start after a messy divorce in the city. How naive I was. How unprepared for the horrors that awaited me in those seemingly peaceful fields. The day I first saw the boy was like any other. I was out in the west field, perched atop my old John Deere, the rhythm of the engine a comforting drone beneath me. The summer sun beat down mercilessly, and I wiped sweat from my brow, my eyes stinging. That's when I saw him. Just a flicker in the tractor's side mirror at first. A small face, pale and solemn, with dark eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I blinked, and in that instant, he was gone. I stopped the tractor, my heart racing. Jumping down, I scanned the field, looking for any sign of a child. But there was nothing. just endless rows of corn swaying gently in the breeze. Must be the heat, I muttered to myself, climbing back into the driver's seat. But as I started the engine, a chill ran down my spine despite the sweltering temperature. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced in the mirror, I half expected to see that pale face again. But there was nothing. As night fell and I made my way back to the farmhouse, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. A trick of the light, perhaps. Or maybe one of the neighbor kids playing a prank. Yet deep down I knew something wasn't right on this farm. And that boy in the mirror was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, the sightings became more frequent. I'd catch glimpses of the boy in reflections, the kitchen window, the bathroom mirror, even in the glossy side of the refrigerator. Always just for a second, always disappearing the moment I tried to focus on him. At first, I tried to ignore it. I threw myself into my work, spending long hours in the fields, trying to drown out the unease with the roar of machinery. But the boy was persistent. One evening, as I was checking the irrigation system, I saw him standing at the edge of the cornfield. This time, he didn't vanish immediately. He stood there, his small form silhouetted against the setting sun, staring at me with those dark, mournful eyes. My throat went dry. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaky. "Are you lost?" The boy didn't respond. He just kept staring, and then slowly raised his hand as if reaching out to me. I took a step forward, and in that instant, he was gone. Not running away, not ducking into the corn, but simply gone. As if he'd never been there at all. Sleep became elusive after that. I'd lie awake at night, straining my ears for any sound of small footsteps, my eyes scanning the shadows for a small figure. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I'd hear what sounded like a child's laughter, distant and echoing. I began to question my sanity. Was I cracking under the pressure of running the farm? Or was there something more sinister at work here? I needed answers, and I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. It was time to talk to someone, to see if anyone else had experienced anything strange on this land. Little did I know, the answers I sought would only lead me deeper into a nightmare I couldn't escape. It was a Friday night when I finally worked up the courage to mention the boy to someone else. The Rusty Nail, our local watering hole, was buzzing with the usual crowd of farmers and townfolk. I nursed my beer, waiting for the right moment. "Say, Jake," I started, trying to keep my voice casual. "You ever hear any strange stories about my farm? About, I don't know, a kid or something?" The bar went quiet. Jake, the oldest farmer in the county, exchanged glances with the others. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, old Tom cleared his throat. "You've been seeing him, haven't you? The boy." My heart raced. "So I'm not crazy? You know about this?" Jake sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 80-plus years. It was about 50 years ago. Frank Miller owned that farm then. Good man, but he had a temper, especially when he drank. The story spilled out, piece by horrifying piece. Frank had a son, barely 6 years old. One night, after a few too many at this very bar, Frank had climbed onto his tractor. His son, trying to stop him from driving drunk, had run out to the field. Frank didn't see him in time, Tom said softly. Ran right over the poor boy. It was an accident, but, well, Frank never forgave himself. Hung himself in the barn a year later. I felt the blood drain from my face. And the boy, his ghost, he's still there? Jake nodded grimly. Some say he's waiting for his pa. Others think he's trying to prevent the same tragedy from happening again. But everyone who's lived on that farm has seen him. And everyone who's seen him. He trailed off, but the implication was clear. I wasn't just seeing a ghost. I was caught in something much darker. As I drove home that night, my mind reeling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was heading towards something inevitable. The boys' appearances, the tragic history of the farm, it all seemed to be building to something. But what? The next few days were a blur of research. I dug through old newspapers at the local library, pored over county records, even visited the small town museum. Everywhere I looked, I found pieces of Frank and his son's story. The similarities between Frank and myself were eerie. We were both in our late 30s when we came to the farm, both struggling with personal demons, his drinking, my failed marriage, both alone, trying to make a new start. As I delved deeper, the paranormal activity at the farm intensified. The boy appeared more frequently, no longer just in reflections. I'd see him standing in the cornfield, or sitting on the porch swing, always watching, always silent. One afternoon, as I was going through a box of old farm receipts, I found a faded photograph. It showed a man, Frank, I assumed, standing next to a tractor. And there, barely visible in the background, was the boy. My blood ran cold as I recognized the exact same tractor I now used in the fields. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the distinct sound of a tractor engine starting up. I rushed to the window, my heart pounding. There, in the moonlit field, I saw the ghostly outline of a tractor moving through the corn. At the wheel was a translucent figure of a man, and running behind, desperately trying to catch up, was the boy. As I watched, transfixed, the scene faded away. But the message was clear. This wasn't just a haunting. It was a tragedy playing out again and again, night after night. And somehow, I knew I was meant to play a part in it. As the harvest season approached, my anxiety grew. The boy's appearances became more frequent, more urgent. It was as if he was trying to warn me of something, but I couldn't understand what. One night, after a particularly long day in the fields, I decided to drive into town for supplies. The road was dark, winding through cornfields that seemed to stretch endlessly on either side. My headlights cut through the darkness, creating eerie shadows that danced across the asphalt. I was lost in thought, replaying the tragic story of Frank and his son in my mind, when suddenly, there he was. The boy, standing in the middle of the road, his pale face illuminated by my headlights. My heart leapt into my throat as I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the pavement. Time seemed to slow down. I could see every detail of the boy's face. His wide, sorrowful eyes, the small cut on his cheek, the way his dark hair ruffled in a breeze I couldn't feel. He raised his hand, reaching out towards me, his mouth opening as if to speak. Then, with a sickening thud, I felt the impact. The car shuddered, and I squeezed my eyes shut, certain I had just killed a child. When I finally found the courage to open them, the road was empty. No boy, no body, nothing. With shaking hands, I got out of the car. The night was silent except for the tick of the cooling engine. I walked around to the front of the vehicle, dreading what I might find. There was no damage, no sign of impact. But there, in the dust on the hood, was a perfect handprint. A child's handprint. I stumbled back to the driver's seat, my mind reeling. As I sat there, trying to process what had just happened, I caught movement in my rearview mirror. The boy was there, in the back seat, his eyes meeting mine in the reflection. His lips moved, and though no sound came out, I could read the words, "It's almost time." The incident on the road shook me to my core. I could no longer deny the reality of what was happening. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a cycle, a tragic loop playing out over and over again. And somehow, I was being pulled into it. I began to notice parallels between my life and Frank's everywhere. The way I'd started having a drink or two to help me sleep. The long, lonely hours in the fields. The growing isolation from the rest of the town. It was as if I was being molded into Frank's image, prepared to take his place in the tragedy. I tried to fight it. I poured out all the alcohol in the house. I made efforts to socialize more, to break out of the patterns I was falling into. But it felt like swimming against a powerful current. The more I resisted, the stronger the pull became. The boy's appearances took on a new meaning now. He wasn't just a ghost, he was a harbinger, a warning of what was to come. But was he trying to prevent the tragedy or ensure it happened again? One evening, as I sat on the porch, I saw him standing at the edge of the field. This time, when he raised his hand, I raised mine in return. A sense of connection, of shared fate, passed between us. In that moment, I understood. This wasn't just about Frank and his son anymore. It was about me. About us. About a cycle of tragedy that had been playing out for decades. As the harvest moon rose over the cornfields, I knew that the final act was approaching. And I was both actor and audience in this ghostly play. The night it all came to a head was unseasonably cold for harvest time. I sat in the old tractor, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I knew what was coming, could feel the weight of inevitability pressing down on me. As I started the engine, the familiar rumble was accompanied by something else. The faint sound of a child's laughter carried on the wind. I looked in the rearview mirror and there he was, the boy, sitting behind me. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, he spoke audibly. "It's time," he said. His voice a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I put the tractor in gear, my heart pounding. As I drove into the field, I could see a ghostly replay of that tragic night 50 years ago superimposed over reality. Frank's spirit at the wheel, the boy running behind, desperately trying to stop his father. Suddenly, the boy appeared in front of the tractor, just as he must have done that fateful night. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. History was repeating itself. The moment of impact never came. Instead, I found myself in an endless loop, reliving those final seconds over and over. The boy appears, I try to stop, and then it resets. Each time, I see Frank's anguished face, feel his remorse and desperation as if they were my own. I don't know how long I've been here, trapped in this moment between life and death, past and present. Time has lost all meaning. All I know is that I'm now part of this farm's tragic history, another echo in its haunted fields. And somewhere out there, I know another farmer will come. The cycle will begin anew. It's been 5 years since I fled my family's farm, yet the memory of that cursed well still haunts my dreams. Before those fateful events, I was just another struggling farmer, trying to make ends meet in an increasingly difficult agricultural market. I never believed in the supernatural or the whispered warnings of the locals. How naive I was. How unprepared for the horrors that lurked beneath the surface of my own land. The old well had always been there, a crumbling stone circle at the far end of the north field. For as long as I could remember, it had been dry, covered with worn planks and avoided by everyone, including my late father. "That well's nothing but trouble," he'd mutter whenever I asked about it as a child. "Leave it be." But times were tough, and the drought that year had been merciless. Every drop of water was precious, and I couldn't afford to ignore a potential source right on my own property. Besides, I reasoned, what harm could come from cleaning out an old well? The day I decided to clear it out was oppressively hot. Sweat dripped down my back as I pried off the old boards, releasing a gust of stale, damp air that carried an oddly metallic scent. Peering into the darkness, I couldn't see the bottom, but something about the shadows seemed to shift and move in a way that made my skin crawl. I shook off the feeling, chiding myself for letting old superstitions get to me. With a determined set to my jaw, I began to lower a rope into the well, preparing to descend and start the cleaning process. As the rope slithered into the darkness, I could have sworn I heard something, a faint whisper, almost like a sigh of relief. Little did I know, I had just opened a door that should have remained forever closed. The work was grueling. Days blended into weeks as I cleared years of debris from the well. But something kept driving me on, a compulsion I couldn't explain. Every shovelful of muck seemed to bring me closer to something. I wasn't sure what, but I knew it was important. It was on a moonless night when I first heard them clearly, the whispers. I was taking a break, wiping sweat from my brow, when a sound drifted up from the depths. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks, but then I heard it again. A voice, faint but distinct, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. My heart raced as I leaned closer to the well's mouth. "Hello," I called down, my voice echoing in the darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a chorus of whispers erupted, overlapping and intertwining in a cacophony that made my head spin. I stumbled back, nearly falling in my haste to get away. But even as I retreated, I felt a pull, an inexplicable urge to listen more closely, to understand what the voices were saying. Over the next few days, I found myself spending more and more time by the well. I'd sit for hours, ear pressed to the stone, straining to catch every word. Slowly, the whispers became clearer. They spoke of the land, of its history, dark secrets that had been buried for generations. I learned of ancient rituals performed on this very spot, of sacrifices made to ensure bountiful harvests. The voices spoke of a pact, sealed with blood, between the first settlers and something old and hungry that lived deep in the earth. With each revelation, I should have been horrified. I should have filled in the well and run. But instead, I found myself drawn deeper into its secrets, desperate to know more. As the days wore on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They no longer waited for the quiet of night. Even in broad daylight, I could hear them calling to me. The voices spoke of dark deeds done in the name of prosperity, children offered to the depths, murderers hiding their victims, generations of sin and secrecy seeping into the very soil of my farm. I learned that my own ancestors had been key players in these grim tales. Great-grandfather Thomas, revered as the town's founder, had orchestrated a mass sacrifice during a devastating drought. Grandmother Elizabeth, known for her kindness, had poisoned her rivals and disposed of their bodies in the well. Each revelation should have repulsed me, but instead, I found myself fascinated. I began to neglect my farm work, spending every waking moment by the well, scribbling down the dark history it revealed. My fingers became stained with ink, my eyes sunken from lack of sleep. Neighbors started to talk. They'd cross the street to avoid me, whispering among themselves about my disheveled appearance and manic energy. But I didn't care. The well's secrets had become my entire world. One night, as I sat by the well under a gibbous moon, the whispers changed. They began to speak of power, ancient, terrible power that could be mine if I was willing to pay the price. They promised knowledge beyond mortal understanding, dominion over life and death. All I had to do was descend into the depths and embrace the darkness waiting there. The offer of power awoke something primal within me. I became obsessed with digging deeper, certain that untold secrets lay just beyond my reach. I abandoned all pretense of farming, selling off livestock and equipment to buy more digging tools. My days and nights blurred together in a frenzy of excavation. I no longer needed sleep or food. The whispers sustained me, filling me with unnatural energy. My body began to change. My skin grew pale and translucent, my eyes adapting to the perpetual darkness of the well. Concerned friends tried to intervene, but I drove them away with wild-eyed ravings about the truths I was uncovering. In lucid moments, I caught glimpses of my reflection and barely recognized the gaunt, dirt-streaked specter I had become. But none of it mattered. Only the dig mattered. Only the whispers mattered. As I delved deeper, the well seemed to change. The walls grew smoother, almost organic in texture. Strange symbols began to appear, carved into the stone, ancient glyphs that burned with an inner light when I touched them. The air grew thick and humid, carrying the scent of decay and something else. Something older than time itself. Sometimes, in the shifting shadows, I caught glimpses of movement, things that slithered and writhed just out of sight. Still, I dug on. The whispers promised that enlightenment was close, that one more foot of earth, one more layer of rock was all that stood between me and ultimate truth. I should have realized I was no longer digging for water or secrets. I was digging my own grave. As I dug deeper, the horrors I unearthed became increasingly disturbing. At first, it was just fragments, a tooth here, a shard of bone there. But soon, I began to uncover entire skeletons, their bones twisted in poses of agony. Some were ancient, others disturbingly recent. All bore signs of violent ends. One fateful night, my shovel struck something solid. Brushing away the dirt, I found myself staring at a stone tablet covered in arcane symbols. As I traced the carvings with my trembling fingers, visions flooded my mind. I saw the rituals performed here centuries ago, robed figures chanting in forgotten languages, sacrificial victims screaming as they were lowered into the well. The whispers grew more excited, urging me to continue. They promised that ultimate knowledge lay just beyond this barrier. With shaking hands, I began to pry at the edges of the tablet. As it came loose, a fetid gust of air rushed past me, carrying with it the stench of millennium-old decay. In the darkness beyond, I saw something move. It was vast, formless, a writhing mass of shadows and teeth. For the first time since I'd started digging, I felt a flicker of fear. But it was too late to turn back now. The entity in the depths had sensed my presence, and it was hungry. The whispers reached a fever pitch, no longer just in my head but reverberating through the very stone around me. They spoke of an ancient pact, a bargain struck between the first settlers and this primordial being. In exchange for knowledge and power, it demanded regular sacrifices. And now, after centuries of slumber, it was awake, and I had freed it. Heart pounding, I began to scramble back up the well. But the walls had changed, becoming slick and organic. My fingers could find no purchase. I was trapped. From the depths, I heard a sound. Not a whisper this time, but a low, rumbling growl that shook the very foundations of the earth. Slowly, inexorably, the entity began to rise. I saw it in flashes as it passed through the dim light of my lantern. Tentacles as thick as tree trunks, covered in eyes that blinked and stared. A maw large enough to swallow a house, lined with row upon row of jagged teeth. And everywhere, faces, the tortured visages of its victims, screaming silently from within its amorphous form. In that moment, I understood the true nature of the well. It wasn't just a portal or a prison. It was the entity itself, ancient, patient, and endlessly hungry. As it rose towards me, the whispers became a deafening chorus. They spoke of joining, of becoming one with the entity, of transcending mortal limitations. Part of me recoiled in horror, but another part, the part that had driven me to dig all these months, felt an inexorable pull. The entity reached for me with appendages of shadow and nightmare. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. As it enveloped me, I felt my very essence being torn apart, my memories and consciousness fragmenting. In a moment of clarity, I realized the terrible truth. I wasn't its victim. I was about to become its newest voice. In that final terrifying moment, as the entity was about to consume me, a surge of survival instinct took over. With strength born of desperation, I clawed at the slimy walls of the well, finding purchase where there had been none before. I climbed, faster than I ever thought possible, the entity's roars of fury echoing behind me. I burst out of the well, gasping for air, and ran. I didn't stop to gather belongings or lock up. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, not daring to look back. Days later, I found myself in a distant city, trying to piece my life back together. But the whispers never truly left me. In quiet moments, I can still hear them, calling me back to the well. I never returned to the farm. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. To hear more stories like this, subscribe and leave a like.